Welcome to the episode of Moral Injury International. I'm Marty O'Connor here in Australia. And
I'm Leo Quinlan here in Ireland.
And Leo, we have a very special guest. Now, could you like to introduce our guest, please?
Yes, indeed, Marty. Today we have Audra Larkin. Now, Audra is a veteran of the Irish Defence Forces, served with them 12 years. She grew up in a military family. Her father and uncles were in the army also. She is now Deputy Chief Executive Officer of ONE, which is Ireland's Veterans Charity Organisation looking after the health and accommodation for veterans. Since leaving the army, Audra achieved academic qualifications to master's level in psychology and science. She has written at least a dozen books, and I just mentioned three of them: Military to Civilian Transition, Trauma and Resilience, Deployment, and Reintegration. As well as being an author, Audra is also a poet. Currently, she focuses on helping veterans cope with problems arising from their experiences, which have led them to be suffering from moral injury and other afflictions. Therefore, we consider that Audra is ideally suited to discuss moral injury with Marty and I, and we are privileged to have her with us today. Over to you, Marty.
Well, this would be great. And let's cross over back to Ireland, and let's cross over to Audra, and we'll have a chat with her. And thank you. Here we go. We'll cross over there. Over to you, Joe, to put that in. Excellent. Audra, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Marty, and good evening to everyone in Australia, and good morning to everyone in Ireland.
Hello,
and
Audra, Marty.
Leo,
I'm here in Carthanel, County Kerry. Looking forward to the chat.
We're going on this episode, and we just heard your intro, and lovely, and seen about your book. So can I just kick off, Audra, and we want to give you as much airtime as possible. Your work is amazing, and we'll speak about your work, but can you start off and tell us about you and what's brought you on this journey, please? And Leo and myself will come in and out when we need to, but we'd like to hear your story. And I'm sure with all the stuff you've done is that the audience wants to know more about you than just your writing, the person behind it. So I'm handing over the microphone to you.
Thanks, Marty. I suppose to begin with, Marty, I have a very unusual start in life in that I was born on an army camp in Crosshaven in County Cork. And that's where I grew up most of my life. And then I moved to another army camp in Cork City and grew up there. So I grew up very much surrounded by military culture and military life. I suppose from that, I went on to work in not only to serve in the Defence Forces, but to work in addiction services, and later moved on to work with veterans. And I suppose that's what's brought me on my life journey and brought me to where I am today and the topics that I'm passionate about.
Yeah, well, I grew up on a military camp, on the Curragh camp. So just elaborate a little bit there.
I suppose for me it's unusual because there's multi-generations of service within our family. So, and when we talk about moral injury, I always look back at my own life and ask, where were my foundations laid? And I suppose very much that's where they were laid, the friendships that were created there. I learned about duty, resilience, and that all came from that upbringing. Friends that I lived beside as a child, I'm still friends with today. We still interact, we still meet up regularly. And it's that foundation of those relationships and understanding what duty and loyalty and service was. And I suppose that became my own foundation.
Wow. Leo.
Audrey, just tell us a little bit more about yourself. are you married, etc., children, and so on. And then we'll get into afterwards then you start telling us what prompted you to write a book. And later on, then we'll touch on the moral injury, what people you've met who've suffered from moral injury and so on. So over to you again.
Absolutely. I suppose I am indeed married. I'm married to Dennis, and we live in Tipperary. We have 4 children of our own, 3 boys and a daughter, and we fostered children for many, many years. So we've always had a very, very busy house. We only have 1 child remaining at home, so life is a bit quieter these days, but nonetheless enjoyable.
Okay.
Wow.
And what prompted you to write a book?
I suppose since I was a child, I've always had this innate ability to transfer thoughts to words. Yeah. And apart from just having that ability, writing is also a processing tool for myself. So if I come across something or I engage in something and I don't fully understand it, I like to write about it, and it gives me a structure and a process to understanding. And that's where writing was born. And particularly in my poetry work, it is definitely a process of retelling stories, understanding stories. And later in my books, I write in a very plain, simple language. I don't use clinical terminology. I don't bamboozle with words. It is simply as it comes from my head as a tool of processing and understanding.
Okay, Audra, can I just jump in and ask you, we kind of skipped over a little bit, what brought you into the army and why did you want to go in? Why did you do that? Where's the background of that? I know you. Yeah.
I have huge intergenerational service, but I suppose the most impactful service in my life was my father's own service, because my father served, my uncles served, and it was a natural progression. It was something I never had to think about because it was going to happen. I knew at a very young age, regardless of what type of service it was going to be, that I would end up there. And then I married a soldier. And then my own son served for a while. So it is just that whole element of I was already in that environment and that culture. It was natural. I knew it. There was no thought in, God, I think I'd like to join up or I'd like to serve. It was a natural progression, and one that I am so eternally grateful for, because I absolutely learned some of the most amazing stuff in my life that I've carried into my professional career.
And you say there, like, just with that is, and as Leo just is, so from military to civilian transition, where did you, sorry, I took over that bit there you were asking, that is, where did that come from? And why?
I had decided after COVID that it really was a time for a career change. And I think that process was going on for a lot of people who would have been in the environments of healthcare during COVID. And there was no planned transition into that work. Working with veterans and seeing moral injury, if I'm to be totally honest, happened by accident. It happened through a phone call I got one day from a former service member who just needed a chat. And that's where it began. And that became my life mission. When people ask me about, I think sometimes people find it a little bit, how did you get into that work? How did you end up working with veterans? And I always say, if I'm to be totally honest, it happened by accident.
A quick question.
Yeah.
That veteran who called you for a chat, Why did he or she select you for a chat?
I suppose that selection came from the fact, and I'm sure you're very aware, Leo, the military community is big, but the military community is also extremely small. It is one family, and that is the way it's viewed. You know, the camaraderie piece, the relationships you build with people while you serve, they last for life. And I
Yeah,
suppose
but what
that
I
is
mean
one of
is,
the big, sorry.
yeah, sorry, I beg your pardon, Audra. What I mean is that person contacted you for a chat. That person must have known that you were receptive to having such a chat. Had you
Yes.
been
Absolutely.
developing a name or a reputation, or were you a person that people would come to because of your work with veterans? Is that why?
Absolutely. I suppose people would have been very aware of my background and the areas I worked in. And I think when somebody is in distress, they are looking for that compassionate witness. They are looking for that person who can sit with them without judgment and without the reinforcement of shame. And I think that's
Yeah.
really important. And that's what that person would have saw. That person would have known my career helping people for many, many years. And that person obviously just observed me as that, you know, compassionate
Yeah.
witness to what was going on for them.
Yeah. A question then that triggers off in my mind. When you say they were aware of what you were doing in your career, in your army career, were you in a position where you were helping people? Was it part of your job? It's just something that you developed, or did
No,
it happen after you left the army?
no, in my service, I was a medic. So I was still in
Ah,
that caring,
there you
compassionate
go.
space.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
that makes sense. And where were you based as a medic?
In Collins's barracks in Cork.
In Cork. Okay, no, it's just that I know medics elsewhere. I just wondered. Okay, so jumping forward slightly, then you left the army. How many years service had you in the army?
I served 12 years.
Okay, all right. So you left the army and you went into, tell us about what you went into and how did you end up, for the want of a better word, discovering moral injury?
Okay.
And then I have some other questions after that.
I suppose the the thing for me in the background was always people. I've always been fascinated by people, and I wanted to explore that a little bit more. So I was studying psychology at the time. I was doing my primary degree in psychology at the time, and a vacancy came up within community addiction services. And I felt to myself, this is exactly where I want to be, because I want to work with people, not to fix them, because there's nobody capable of that. But I always knew I wanted to work in a caring and compassionate space where I was able to give a space to people. A vacancy came up in community addiction services, and I was lucky enough to secure that vacancy. And that's how that happened. Was there a great plan to move into addiction or to move into trauma? No, I think I was on a journey of discovery for myself as well at the time.
Mhm.
And but I knew it would be in a caring and compassionate industry.
Okay. And as a result of what you moved into and so on, you probably found a very fertile ground among veterans because of everything that veterans would have suffered,
Yes.
particularly since this is a moral injury podcast as well as everything else. If you don't mind, just to digress slightly and tell you where Marty and I come from, and this for viewers who will be watching this for the first time. What's all this moral injury business? Marty and I are at this for 6 years. We've been with scores and scores of people from 4 continents on moral injury, and it's all the same story. But it started with us basically as a result of the Irish Army in the Congo, okay, where and we kind of identify moral injury as a situation that occurs when soldiers suffer some traumatic experience and are then betrayed by higher authority. And the betrayal and the shame, you mentioned shame already, and things like that all come into play. We've discovered the same thing in things like the HSE, in the National Health Service in England, in police forces in the United States, and in different countries, it's the same thing, not just in military terms, but we're military here today. And the side effects that we've seen of moral injury, the people we know, personally we know, is broken relationships. They go silent. They don't talk about it until something triggers it off in later life. Before they die, they want to say something. Break up in marriages, broken relationships, heavy drinking, depression, and unfortunately taking their own lives. So that's the way where we're coming from. And again, for audience, our main aim, as one of the reasons we're talking to you today, and thank you for this, is to continue to raise the awareness about moral injury. So on that basis, would you like to tell us about what you discovered about moral injury? Give us cases without naming people, of course. Just some examples, if you can.
Absolutely. And I suppose, did I know what moral injury was when I went into the roles I went into? I knew about shame. I knew about isolation. I knew about all of that, but I didn't have the name moral injury. And I suppose it began very early in my work in addiction services, because what I began to see was people identified with the identity of being an addict or being an alcoholic. So when I met people, they automatically introduced themselves based in that narrative of what they told themselves they were. And it was that self-narrative piece around, if I'm to introduce myself to you, Leo, I'll go, my name is Audra. And that had disappeared for these people. It was, I'm the alcoholic, I'm the addict. And it could be 15 minutes later before you would hear, and my name is whatever my name is. So for me, right from the outset, there was this little piece of, where did these people find the narrative that supported that identity? And I suppose that's really where it began for me. And the more I looked into it, one of the common terms I use is the stories beneath the stories. Because when I was dealing with people in addiction, there was the narrative they were telling the world. But behind that narrative was shame, guilt, trauma. And what I became to realize is I wasn't working with addiction. I was working with shame and trauma and guilt and all of those things, that the addiction was actually only the behavior.
Yeah.
And can I just jump in there for a second? What you're saying, because you've triggered something in my head, is obviously we were going to be talking about, but the transgenerational is that carries on, because as I always say, is you watch your children growing up, but your children watch you growing up. So it has a ripple effect. And going back to just what we're saying is, where does the trauma comes from? Somewhere, but you'll normally find even the person that has suffered it will portray it on their family, and there's no duty of care there. Sorry, Audra.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right, because that intergenerational piece, children don't inherit moral injury. Children inherit stories, histories, family culture, family tradition. I have worked with people who have sat in a therapy room and talked about the history and how it's passed down, owning that, when in actual fact, they had no control over that. They inherited the history. They inherited the moral injury. Children aren't born with moral injury. Children aren't born, understanding what trust is. Children aren't born knowing right from wrong. It is that piece of, the architects in our lives. Who do we learn from? What do we observe? At what point in our lives do we realize the world is a safe place or the world is not a safe place? When a child cries and you respond to a child's cry, the child creates that narrative that when I'm distressed, somebody responds to me. If the foundations are fragile, what does a child learn? A child learns when I cry, it doesn't matter. That turns into the narrative of I don't matter.
Wow. That's I need to jump in there because oh God, you've it's like we talk about the moral injury, and just you explained it so well, is the guilt part of it. Kids blame themselves and think that we are not worthy.
Yes.
We did something wrong. Would I be correct?
Absolutely. And I suppose the dangerous thing with guilt, Marty, is guilt very quickly turns to shame.
Yeah.
And
shame, we've heard this.
Yeah.
Sorry,
continue. And shame leads to silence.
That exactly. Shame tells us we must hide and we must not tell, or we will never find a safe space to tell the story. We will never find the compassionate witness who will help us on the journey of that story, because shame tells us that we're not worthy of that space. And that's the danger.
Yeah. Audra, many years ago, I'm talking about maybe 20, 30 years ago, I met a veteran who was an extremely brave man in battle, exceptionally brave, recommended for the military medal for gallantry and everything. And, he was in the category of what we're talking about, moral injury. And he said, he used, the first time I ever heard the word shame used in this context, he said, we have nothing to be ashamed of. He was a strong man and he lived with it. And
Absolutely.
He said, we have nothing to be ashamed of. We did what we had to do. And he said that to a group of people very strongly at a funeral of another veteran. We have nothing to be ashamed of. But the other thing I wanted to mention is that about a month ago, I read about moral injury. Some academic fellow delving, I forget his name, delving deep into moral injury. He said, one of the most sinister parts, I'm paraphrasing, one of the most hurting things or hurtful things about moral injury is that it becomes intergenerational, as we've mentioned, but it becomes part of the family DNA.
Yeah.
Now that's frightening. DNA in the family.
It is absolutely frightening because it becomes so embedded that the next generation of children take on ownership of something from maybe 2 or 3 or 4 generations back. They learn, oh, we don't talk about this. They learn, we don't trust them. And it continues to evolve. And it's a very lonely place for somebody to sit in that and wonder, am I the reason? Am I the cause? When it may have in fact been generations before. So
correct.
It's not inherited.
No.
But what's inherited is history, stories, and silence.
Yeah. We've had people telling us lots of harrowing stories about that, where their father never spoke to them after the incident, or where the mother could never show any emotion anymore because of the results of the father coming back in a certain way. And we know of children who are my age, of the people that were in the battle. We're talking about the Battle of Jadwal. Who they don't talk to each other, and their children don't talk to each other, and the families have split and they don't meet and so on. And that's an ongoing tragedy.
And that's that inherited piece, isn't it?
Yep,
because those children actually had no experience of that.
Can I say this,
through.
Audra, exactly what you're saying? Can I say this? A friend of mine said this, he lives in Kilkenny. He's known me for years. And basically, he used the words, and correct me if I'm wrong, he said, yeah, we're talking, your DNA was survival. And you talked there about, and I can say this firsthand, is that you're kind of, it's in your DNA to survive. But as a young, that's the transgeneration. You felt I'm alone because, as I said earlier, you watch your parents grow up, but you watch them grow up, and that affects you.
Absolutely. And I think, as parents, we all try to do our best, but we also try to protect. And we are hardwired for survival. Yeah. So by trying to, if you take a parent who teaches a child, lying is not right. But in the same instant, if that child is viewing lies as a daily interaction, that's very confusing for a child.
Yeah.
And a child, and all of us throughout our life, across our lifespan, we are constantly adjusting our morals and our values, and we are moving as we move because they are based on our experiences as people. And I think that is the piece for that intergenerational piece. The next generation base their narrative around what they see, what they hear, what they observe. And I think that's where the ownership for that sometimes lays heavy on those who actually were not part of the original experience, or may have not experienced the event, because moral injury is not about an event. It's not about the door banged and that scared me. Moral injury is about what did that door banging mean for that person. It's the meaning they attach to it. And if a person believes I caused this, or I did this, or I'm responsible for this, that's the narrative. That's the story they create themselves around.
100%.
Do you agree? Do you agree, Audra, that the betrayal factor by higher authority is a very important element of this whole moral injury?
I think betrayal is very much an element of moral injury, and a very important element of moral injury. I think when you put betrayal next to shame, next to guilt, next to the internal narrative, it can be a very, very, damning experience for those that experience it.
And do you think Audra is as Leo said earlier and on the intro, is it leads to suicide, but, and I'm using this as a term, as in we just go to, say, the siege of Jarville, out of 165 men, there was about 10,000 offsprings, including me. I was a Jarville baby, but also on top of that is that it goes down to transgeneration and the way they feel about it. But like it, I say this, and forgive me, I'm stuttering a little bit because I'm trying to get the words out, is that it affects the family, and which leads to, and I have to say this because everybody knows I say this, but that led to the mother suffering it. And like you said, as you were just alluding to there, is that someone has 10% that can travel on because they can't deal with that. And then the family, which leads on, which can go on to suicide, even at the furthest, the latest measure of it.
And I think that's that piece of the inheritance, isn't it? Inheritance and observance.
Yeah.
We inherit the story, we observe the behaviors.
Yes.
We internalize the behavior, which adds to the experience that we build a story on.
Yeah. Wow.
And that is the piece where intergenerational moral injury has such a huge impact. When you have people who have mental health difficulties, you have people who are in addiction because they believe that they carry the weight and the responsibility of the experience.
Yeah. Two things, Audra, that just jump into my mind. One is that, which we haven't mentioned in this podcast, we've done it before, moral injury and post-traumatic stress. They're linked, but they're different. Okay? Post-traumatic stress, you can kind of identify it, you can help it, you can cure it to a degree, and so on. Moral injury is more of an injury to the soul, right? This is as I've described
I
it.
suppose.
And this, you're forced to do something that goes against your upbringing, your religion, your family values, and so on and so forth. And then as a result of that, you live with a bit of guilt and blah, 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 as you've been saying. That's the first point I wanted to make. And I see you're nodding your head, so you probably agree with me. The next thing I just wanted to ask you is that you must have met a lot of people, veterans and non-veterans, we call them, who have, to varying degrees, suffered from moral injury. I presume you've kept a great record of all of this, and you have files on everybody. I'm not asking for details or anything like that, but you must have a lot of information that has to be very, very useful to people in the business of helping people. Am I correct? You must have an awful lot.
I suppose I'm going to go back to your first piece first, because you mentioned it there, the injury of the soul. That became the defining moment of my career. That there is exactly where I figured out what moral injury was. Because I sat in a therapy room with a young man one day, and we had a discussion, and it was going on for about 10 minutes, and he was absolutely obsessed with the work that I did. And he asked me a very simple question. He said, "What do you do all day?" And I think when you're faced with that question, we all kind of go, whoa, what do I do? But we had a conversation, and it ended up where I said, I would like to think that I help people. And very firmly he interjected, and he went, and this was all he said. He said, "Nope." And I'm sitting across from him, and I'm going, oh, okay, what does no mean? So I gave him back the question, and I said, well, you tell me what you think I do. A young man, very wise beyond his years, and I will tell you why. He turned around to me and he said, "I think you mind broken souls." And that was a profound statement. And he followed that up with, "I don't do drugs because I want to get high. I don't drink because I want to get drunk. I use them because it takes away the pain in my soul." And Leo, that ties exactly into what you are saying about an injury that cuts to the very core of everything we believe, everything we value, everything we think we are. And suddenly you are faced with an event or with something happening that flips that on its head. And the next question was, so who am I now? And I think that's where that piece of the injury, and that was the defining moment in my career. That I have carried that with me my whole professional career. And that is the moment I understood this is not addiction. This is not behavior. This is something that cuts to the core of people.
Wow.
Okay. Right. And the second part of my question.
The second part is, and you highlighted something very important, is trauma, PTSD, moral injury are separate entities, but they coexist sometimes together.
Mhm.
I think as we go on, Shay was an amazing man. He tells us what moral injury is. He's experienced working in the field of moral injury, and his writings are amazing. And I think for people who are working in services, they have learned a lot about moral injury through client contact, through things like, just processing and writing. And a lot of my work ties into moral injury when I write, because I have learnt that in the therapy room. So
Yeah,
sorry.
No, I was saying we have a friend who's written the book, is Dr. Wally Jensen, and he joined us, but he was too busy to stay on. But I find it fascinating because, as I say all the time, mine is transgenerational. Now, I'm going to ask a quick one here is, I find is, I'll use the words this way. You got post-traumatic stress. You go to the doctor. Now, over here in Australia, up in Western Australia now with Nikki Jameson that we had on the show, they used to the doctor would tick off a box for post-traumatic stress. Now it's moral injury as well, because moral injury, and you alluded to it earlier, is sitting and talking, sharing your problem, community. And I think that's very, very important to understand it. And I find that once you understand moral injury, what you know what it actually is, you don't need a pill, and it takes a weight, as Leo knows, I've been on Send, it takes a weight off your shoulder, because as you said earlier, is that it wasn't my fault as a kid. It wasn't the person's fault, on the duty of care that was given from above.
Absolutely. And I think, I'm going to tie together a piece that Leo said and a piece that you said there. I think ultimately we are the generation that is exploring and identifying moral injury. We are doing what happened in the 80s and the 90s around PTSD. We're exploring it. We're saying it's here. We've experienced it. We've worked with it. And I think that is the key. It is that education piece, because it is people working on the ground who are interacting with moral injury every day of the week, that they have the knowledge and they have the skills to say, okay, this is what presents, but when we provide that space to be the compassionate witness, we don't reinforce change or shame. We don't, we don't sit there and reinforce that. That space is where the learning happens. And it happens on the ground every day of the week. So it's about bringing groups of like-minded people together who work, and I'm not saying work specifically in moral injury, because sometimes moral injury comes into the therapy room, but it could be 6 months later before you identify that moral injury is in the therapy room with you. Because it's, when I worked in addiction services, people would come in angry. Angry is only the gatekeeper of emotions.
Right.
So it could take 6 sessions or 12 sessions to get the story beneath the story of anger. And I think that's what's critically important, that we have those people who are working in that field, and the knowledge and the wealth of experience that they can bring to the whole area of moral injury is phenomenal. Because they're working in it, they're dealing with it. And as you rightly said, Marty, the key to examining moral injury with the client is providing that space. They're not going to make me feel worse than I am. They're not going to judge me for who I am. They're not going to make me feel that I'm not worthy of having my story heard. And that is the key.
Leo,
Audra,
can I let you jump in now? Guys, we've got about 5 minutes left before the show ends, even though I could talk all day. And Audra, I'll bring in a couple of questions after and talk about your new book that you're bringing out next year. But you're amazing. But Leo, I want you to jump in because you introduced me to moral injury 6 years ago.
yes, indeed. Audra, without mentioning anybody's names or anything like that, can you give us just 2 or 3 examples of people, veterans preferably, because we're started with veterans, 2 or 3 examples of how moral injury has affected people that you know, just for the viewers, because I mean, I could give you 20 examples, but to hear maybe 2 or 3 from you, if that's not asking you too much.
I suppose when we talk about veterans and their experiences, there's many experiences that many people who are not veterans experience too. But I suppose what's different is when you serve in a military culture, loyalty, respect, duty, no different than if you were a doctor or you were a police officer.
Yeah.
What happens for people, and I'm thinking of one case in particular, is observing an incident, observing the loss of life, observing humanitarian disaster. And for one particular veteran, it was that struggle between, I call it the shoulda, coulda, woulda phenomenon. That's what I've named it.
Yeah.
Because what happened for this veteran was, I should have got there earlier. I could have prevented it. I would have done this. I could have done this. And that's internalized. We're human beings. We're built for connection. We want to help people. We want to ensure people are safe. We like to think we're a decent person. And when that veteran was faced with that event, the shoulda, coulda, woulda phenomenon started. So now what I had was a veteran who had now internalized this experience that he had no control over. He couldn't change no matter what he would do. But he owned it, that. And it was very hard for him to separate that out because I was a soldier. My identity is to help people, to keep people safe. That's what I've done my whole life. And in an incident of 30 seconds, he was faced with, it turned from, I should have done something, I could have done something, and it turned very much into, I was useless. I had nothing positive to offer. So can you see how the story translates to an internal narrative?
Yeah.
And it was very simply about stripping it back, going into the guilt place and identifying in that guilt place, what do you actually own in this? Because when you do that and when you break it up and you pull it apart, very fast, the person who's holding that realizes the guilt is unfounded. So guilt is one of the big things, Leo, that I would see where moral injury is present.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, we have a lot of stories ourselves from different people, and we could talk for hours about individual cases, and it all boils down to more or less what you said. And thank you for that, because actually you, again, I've used this expression before, you have validated actually what Marty and I have been doing for the last 6 years in trying to raise the awareness of moral injury. The fact that we and you are on the same track, it gives us a bit of confidence. I know I'm speaking okay for you, Marty, in this as well, but I think you agree with me. So thank you for that.
No, thank
Audra,
you.
Can I say, Audra, is not just that, I know we're kind of close to time here, and we are going to we're going to finish off at the end, which would be lovely. We're going to finish off with all your pictures that you've sent, and some lovely music from Pat Brady, my good friend here in the background. I won't give you the hint. Now, I just want to say is you've got a new book coming out next year. And I love the title, and I've watched it, and we'll see this. It'll come up. I know it's coming out next year, and this is what I'm fascinated. I'm reading this now just to I get it right. It's coming out. It's Fractures of the Soul, Understand Moral Injury, and the Invisible Wounds We Carry. Now, I can relate to that, going back to everything you said, and Leo, I know, can relate completely. And especially as a young person, it can hurt more, but it can come back at any time through the years.
And I think that is it in its essence. Moral injury is a hidden wound. But moral injury, I always say this, an open wound, a broken leg, we can see it, we can identify it, we know it takes time to heal, we know the person needs rest. With moral injury, it is embedded in the core of the individual. And it's not until that one event or that one experience happens that triggers it off. May the person even realize that it's there. Because it's
it can trigger when you're a young kid, and then it can come back when you're 50.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And as Leo said at the start, we see it right across frontline services. We see it in police officers, we see it in hospital care staff, we see it in doctors. It's there, and every single person is open to moral injury. We all face moral dilemmas in our lives.
Yes. With certain degrees. You can have 10%, 20%, or 100%, or go on. Now, Leo, I'm going to let you finish up there. And then also just thrown in there as well is, which I might show that off there, with Tracy Conley, ONE, voluntary member. But the work that you do with ONE to help vets, where does that inspire you? You're always helping everyone else. How does that go?
I think we come into the world in sequence, and I think my sequence was to be in the caring field. I suppose there's a few things going on when we talk about the ONE, and the ONE is a charity for veterans of the Defence Forces, and the primary focus is mental health and homelessness.
Yeah.
And I suppose that's something I am just so passionate about. People who have served and given their life in service and supporting them. And that's where that comes from. People are faced with stuff every day. People are struggling with stuff every day. And if I can be that compassionate witness or that compassionate place, then isn't it easy to do that?
And Audra, before we finish, I'm going to let Leo get the last say, but just what you're saying there is this friend of mine that's served and lives in Ireland, and he said to me, I felt I was thrown on the dump heap. There has to be something after, and that's what your book is, Military to a Civilian Transition. But also, as I say, we're looking forward to your new one we're going to put up. So, Leo, I'm going to let you finish up because, guys, we're running out of time here.
Look, there's not an awful lot left me to say, Audra, except thank you very, very much for coming to talk to Marty and I. For the reasons I've already said, you've confirmed to us that we are still on the right track in what we're talking about, moral injury, and raising awareness of it. And you are certainly raising awareness of moral injury with what you're doing. And you are like boots on the ground in this case. You're dealing with veterans who have difficulties and others, apart from veterans who have difficulties. And that's very admirable. I take my hat off to you. Thank you very, very, very much. And I hope to meet you someday because I do a little bit of work from time to time for ONE, raising funds and so on like that. I think it's a fantastic organization. And, the Army, whether you leave it, I'm nearly 40 years out of the Army, having done 25 years in the Army. And still, I feel I'm in the Army.
Absolutely.
Once we're in the uniform, you're still Army. But Audra, thank you very, very much. Appreciate very much talking to us today.
And thank you both for the opportunity just to raise awareness about moral injury.
Audra, you said something earlier, and we're going to put up at the end. You can follow Audra on all social media, but I think this is very educational, and I use that words because you want to know something beforehand. So, Audra, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a pleasure.
Thank you, Marty, and thank you, Leo.
God bless you. God bless Audra.
Okay, thank you to our audience here in Australia and all over the world. And you can follow Audra's story, and you can follow us on our both channels and on Spotify for audio podcasts. And we shall see you on the next episode. Please follow us. Thank you very much, Audra and Leo.
Thank you.
Good night for tonight.
God bless.